The beeping was the first thing I heard. Not my alarm, not the television I always leave on too loud. Just that steady, mechanical sound that I slowly realized had nothing to do with my house. I didn't know where I was for about 30 seconds. Maybe longer. My eyes couldn't focus right away, and everything had that strange, too bright quality that reminded me of being a child with a high fever, when the ceiling of your bedroom seems farther away than it should be. Then a nurse leaned over me and said, "Mrs. Calloway, can you hear me?" And I thought, Calloway, that's me. That's still me. I had been in the garden. That's the part that still catches me off guard when I think about it. How ordinary the moment was before everything changed. I was 63 years old, healthy enough, or so I thought. I'd had my coffee that morning. I'd watered my tomato plants. I had been thinking about whether to call my son before dinner or wait until the weekend when he was less busy. I bent down to pull a weed near the fence, and the world tilted. I remember the grass against my cheek. I remember thinking, that's strange, the way you think something mild and unimportant before you realize what's actually happening. I remember the sound of the neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the street. After that, nothing. What I found out later, pieced together from the doctors and from Opal, my neighbor across the street who had been watching from her porch, was that I had been face down in the dirt for nearly 12 minutes before she noticed I hadn't moved. She was 71 years old, and she crossed that street in her house slippers and called 911 before she even knelt down beside me. She held my hand in the ambulance, she told me later. She rode the whole way. At the hospital, they told her I had suffered a cardiac event, not a full heart attack, but close enough that they needed to watch me carefully. They put me in the ICU for observation. They ran tests, and they started trying to reach my emergency contact. My son, Tobias, no, sorry, that's from another story. My son. His name is Arthur. Arthur, who I had put down as my emergency contact 4 years ago when I filled out that form at my doctor's office. Arthur, who lived 40 minutes away with his wife and their 2 kids. Arthur, who I still called every Sunday, even when he forgot to call back. The hospital called him 31 times over 9 hours. 31 times. He never picked up. I didn't know any of this while it was happening, of course. I was unconscious for most of that first day and drifting in and out for the second. The first time I was truly awake, truly present enough to understand what was being said to me. It was a Tuesday morning, and the light outside the window was gray and thin. A doctor, young, patient, the kind of tired that comes from caring too much, sat down in the chair beside my bed and explained what had happened to my heart. He explained what they had done. He told me I was going to be okay, that they had caught it in time, that I was lucky Opal had been sitting on her porch. And then, carefully, he told me they had been unable to reach my emergency contact. "We reached your neighbor instead," he said. "She's been here every day." I looked at the door. Opal was standing just outside the glass, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands, looking in at me with the expression of someone who has been worried for a very long time and is only now starting to breathe again. I said, "What about my son?" The doctor paused. Just briefly, but I noticed. "We're still trying to reach him." Arthur called on the 3rd day. By that point, I was sitting up. I had eaten real food. Opal had brought me a cardigan from my house. She had a spare key I gave her 2 winters ago after I locked myself out. And I was wearing it over my hospital gown, feeling almost like a person again. My phone had been on the nightstand. I had looked at it several times. I had not called Arthur myself. I don't know exactly why. Some part of me was waiting. Some part of me needed to see what he would do. He called at 2:17 in the afternoon. I know because I looked at the screen for a moment before I answered. "Mom." His voice was warm, easy, the voice he uses when nothing is wrong in his world. "Hey, I've been meaning to call. It's been a crazy few days. We took the kids up to the lake house. Denise's parents invited us last minute. You know how that goes. I left my phone in the car half the time. Terrible signal up there anyway." He laughed a little. I said, "Arthur." "Yeah? The hospital called you 31 times. Silence. Not a long silence, maybe 3 seconds. But it was the kind of silence that tells you everything, because it was the silence of someone calculating, not someone feeling. Mom, my phone was in the car. I just said, they called from 3 different numbers, I said. Over 9 hours. I saw some missed calls, but I didn't recognize the number, and the signal was, Arthur. He stopped. I was in the ICU, I said. What came next is hard to describe without sounding like I'm being unfair. I know how memory works, how we edit things in our favor, how grief and hurt can make a villain out of someone who is simply thoughtless. But I also know what he said next, and I have not forgotten a word of it. He said, Mom, you know I can't just drop everything every time something comes up. I have kids, I have responsibilities. Denise's parents had been planning this trip for months. You would have wanted me to be there for the family. I sat with that for a moment. Every time something comes up, as if this were a pattern. As if I had a history of collapsing in my garden and inconveniencing him. I had a cardiac event, I said. They didn't know if I was going to wake up. But you did wake up, he said, and his voice had shifted into something that I can only describe as mild irritation, the tone of a man who feels he is being accused of something he doesn't think is fair. And you're okay. So can we I'll talk to you later, Arthur, I said, and I hung up. Opal was in the chair beside me. She had heard enough. She didn't say anything for a while. She just refilled my water glass from the pitcher on the table and set it within reach. That's the thing about Opal. She doesn't perform comfort. She doesn't say, oh, honey, or I'm so sorry, or any of the other things people say when they want you to feel better quickly so the moment can be over. She just stays. She does the small, practical things. She is present. We had been neighbors for 11 years. Her husband passed 6 years ago. Mine passed 8 years before that. We had spent a lot of Sunday afternoons on one porch or the other, drinking iced tea and talking about nothing important. I had never fully understood until that week how much that meant. They kept me 4 more days for monitoring. Arthur came on the 5th day. He brought flowers, grocery store flowers, the kind in the plastic sleeve, and he sat in the chair where Opal usually sat, and he was sorry, he said. He had felt terrible about it. Denise said he should have come sooner, and he agreed. He should have. It was a crazy few days, and he hadn't handled it right. I watched him talk. He looked like his father around the eyes. He always had. When he was small, I used to watch him sleep and think that I couldn't imagine a version of my life without him in it. I said, I know you're sorry. I really am, Mom. I know, and I let it sit there, because sorry is just a word, and words don't show up in house slippers to hold your hand in an ambulance. Opal drove me home. She had cleaned my kitchen while I was in the hospital. She had watered my tomato plants. She had pulled the weed I had been reaching for when I collapsed. I noticed that, and it made me cry, unexpectedly, standing in the garden in the late afternoon. She pretended not to see. She went inside to make tea. Her daughter Marisol lived in Portland, called every few days, flew back twice a year, worried out loud about Opal living alone. Opal told her she was fine. She meant it. She had her garden and her neighbors and her Sunday afternoons. I started to understand what she had been trying to tell me, without words, for a long time. The trouble with Arthur didn't end with the phone call in the hospital. That was, if I'm being honest, where it began. About 3 weeks after I came home, he called with what he described as just an idea. The lake house, Denise's parents' lake house, had a small cottage on the property that wasn't being used. They had been talking, he and Denise, and they thought it might be nice if I came to stay there for a while. Just to recover. Just to have people nearby. I said that sounded lovely and I would think about it. What I didn't say was that I had already heard from my attorney. I have a will. I made it after my husband died, when Arthur was in his late 20s, and the practical reality of being the only parent hit me all at once. Everything was set up neatly, the house, my savings, around $90,000, carefully kept over many years, split between Arthur and a charitable organization I care about. My attorney, a quiet, careful woman named, Well, I've been calling her simply my attorney because she values her privacy. Had called me 2 days after I got home from the hospital to check on me. She knew because a mutual friend had mentioned it. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth. She listened for a long time. Then she said gently, "You know you can change anything in that document whenever you want." I said, "I know." We didn't talk about it further, but I thought about it for several days after. Denise called the week after Arthur. Denise, who I have always found difficult to read, who smiles with great enthusiasm and says the right things, and somehow never quite makes me feel welcome at family dinners. She called to say she hoped I was feeling better, and that she wanted me to know they had been so worried. "We felt awful that we missed those calls," she said. "The signal up there is just impossible." I said, "It's all right, Denise. We really felt terrible." "I'm sure you did." There was a small pause, and then she said, "Arthur mentioned you seemed a little distant when he visited. I just want you to know we really do care about you, your family." I thanked her for calling. When I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while and looked out at the garden. Your family. As if that were a thing you said to someone who knew they were, rather than a reassurance you offered when you were worried they were starting to question it. Opal came by that evening with soup she had made from scratch. She sat at my kitchen table while I ate it, reading a novel she had brought. She didn't ask about the phone call. She didn't ask how I was feeling about things. At some point she looked up and said, "Good soup?" I said, "Wonderful soup." She went back to her book. A month after I came home, I called my attorney. I didn't make any dramatic announcements. I didn't write letters or have confrontations. I simply sat down with a woman who had known me for 15 years, who looked at documents and numbers and futures with clear, unsentimentally kind eyes. And I told her what I wanted. My house, when the time came, I wanted left to Marisol, Opal's daughter, with the understanding that it would give Opal a place to live as long as she needed one. My savings, all $90,000, I wanted divided 3 ways. A third to the animal shelter where I had been volunteering for 7 years. A third to a scholarship fund at the local community college, and a third to Opal directly, with no conditions and no strings. Arthur, I left out entirely. My attorney looked at me for a moment after I finished explaining. "You're sure?" she said. It wasn't a question exactly. More like the pause you give someone before a door closes. "I'm sure," I said. I didn't tell Arthur. Not right away. Not that fall when he called on Sundays again with the easy, warm voice of a man who believed things were fine now. Not at Thanksgiving when I declined his invitation and spent the day at Opal's instead, surrounded by Marisol, who had flown in from Portland, and a collection of Opal's friends who were loud and funny and made me eat twice as much as I intended. I started to feel that autumn like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had finally exhaled. The call came in January. Arthur. He had spoken to someone, a cousin, I think, or possibly a family friend, who had mentioned, without realizing they were causing trouble, that they had heard I had visited my attorney recently and made some updates to my estate planning. His voice on the phone was different than it had ever been with me, tighter. There was an urgency in it that he was trying to contain. "Mom, I've been hearing some things. I just want to talk." "Of course," I said. "What do you want to talk about?" "Someone mentioned, I'm not trying to pry, but have you changed your will?" I looked out my window. It was a gray January morning. Opal's car was in her driveway. Her kitchen light was on. "Yes," I said. He was quiet. "Arthur, I love you," I said, and I meant it in the complicated way that you can love someone and also be finished making yourself smaller for them. But I spent 3 days in a hospital not knowing if I was going to be okay, and the person who held my hand in the ambulance was my neighbor. The person who cleaned my kitchen and watered my garden and sat with me every day was my neighbor, and you were at a lake house. Mom, I don't need you to apologize again. I know you regret it. I believe that you do. But regret doesn't change what happened, and at this point in my life, I'm not interested in waiting for things to change. I'd rather just do things that reflect how I actually feel. He was quiet for a long time. "Is there anything I can say?" he asked finally. "I thought about that honestly. You could start showing up," I said. "Not for the will, not for anything like that. Just show up, like a son, and see what happens. I don't know what Arthur will do. I'm not holding my breath. What I know is this: I am 63 years old, and for a long time I believed that family was the people whose names were on your emergency contact form. I believed that blood created obligation, that obligation eventually became presence, that presence would eventually become the thing that looks like love. I don't believe that anymore. What I believe now is that love is Opal in her house slippers, crossing a street she didn't have to cross. Love is soup made from scratch on an ordinary Tuesday. Love is someone who stays, not because they have to, but because it does not occur to them to leave. I kept my $90,000. I kept my house. I kept my garden, where the tomatoes came back this past summer better than they ever had. And I kept Opal, across the street, with her kitchen light on every morning when I look out my window. Proof that the family you find can be every bit as real as the family you were born into, and sometimes a great deal more present. I've been thinking lately about what it actually costs to ignore someone, not the dramatic version of that, not the big obvious consequences that make for satisfying endings in movies. I mean the quieter cost. The way that when you consistently choose something else over a person, you are making a statement about what they are worth to you, and eventually, that person hears it. Even if you never said a word. Arthur never told me he didn't care. He never would have. He's not cruel, not in the way that announces itself. He's the kind of person who always has a reason. The signal was bad. The trip had been planned for months. I was okay, wasn't I? Everything turned out fine. And that's what I kept coming back to in those first weeks after I came home. This idea that because I survived, because I was walking around and eating and watering my tomatoes again, the whole thing could be filed away under close call and life could continue as it was before. He seemed to genuinely believe that. I don't think he was pretending. But here's what I learned. Lying in that hospital bed with Opal, in the chair beside me, survival is not the same as being fine. You can be alive and also fundamentally changed by what happened to you. You can recover physically and still be sitting with the knowledge of exactly who showed up and who did not. That knowledge doesn't go away because the crisis is over. What Arthur never understood, and maybe still doesn't, I honestly can't tell, is that trust is not rebuilt by apology. It's rebuilt by behavior, and behavior takes time and consistency and a willingness to actually change something, not just feel bad about it for a week and then drift back into old patterns. I'm not a bitter person. I want to say that clearly, because I think people sometimes mistake clarity for bitterness. I know what I feel. I know what I saw. I made a decision based on those things, and I would make it again. What Opal gave me in those days was not exceptional. It was just presence. She didn't do anything dramatic. She crossed a street. She made soup. She sat in a chair. And somehow those small, unglamorous acts of showing up told me more about love than 30 years of Sunday phone calls ever had. I think there's something there worth sitting with, no matter where you are in your own life. Not everyone gets to choose their family. But everyone, at some point, gets to choose how they treat the people who depend on them. They get to decide whether to answer the phone, whether to cross the street, whether to stay. Those choices add up. They become, over time, the entire story of who you are to someone. Arthur made his choices. I made mine. And I keep the garden now because I want to, not because I have to answer to anyone. Just me and the tomatoes that came back this summer, better than ever, and Opal's kitchen light across the street every morning. That's enough. That is genuinely, completely enough.